Hi everyone, it's Jacqueline. So today we're going to be thinking about IB history, the IA section 1, which is called the identification and evaluation of sources. So I'm going to talk you through this section today and really the best way to approach it. I'll give you some examples of a good way to write your section 1 for the IA. So first of all, you have to know this is worth 6 marks. Now, it's not worth, 6 marks. If you consider the whole IA, the total comes to 25 marks. So of course, 6 marks out of 25, it's not nearly as important as your investigation section, but of course you want to pick up all 6 marks for this section, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. So the other thing that you should know is that you should be aiming to write about 500 words for this section. So it's not a lot. Therefore, you have to be really concise in your language, and you have to be really, really clear in what you're saying. So this section requires you to pick 2 sources. Your sources can be primary or secondary sources. Now, what I would recommend is that you pick 1 primary source and 1 secondary source. The reason being that secondary sources often have similar values. For example, if you have 2 secondary sources that were written by renowned historians, then the value of their origin is going to be quite similar. So if you choose a primary source and a secondary source for this section, you're going to be able to identify the values and limitations of these sources, and they're not going to sound like the same, like it's not going to sound like you're making the same point again and again. So that's what I'd recommend, but it's not a rule. If you choose 2 primary sources or if you choose 2 secondary sources for this section, that is okay. So your sources must be relevant to your investigation. Hopefully that's common sense, and you really should use your sources throughout your investigation. So the examiner needs to be able to see a clear link between section 1, the identification and evaluation of sources, and section 2, the investigation part of your IA. Okay, so firstly, now we're going to think about when you are writing this section. So firstly, you must clearly state your chosen research question. And you have to make sure that you state this as a question. Okay, that's, it's a simple thing to do, but the IB specifies that you need to state it as a question. So here is the example. The question that will be investigated is, to what extent did the Night of Long Knives consolidate Hitler's power over Germany in 1934? Okay, so you can see that we've got a research question. It's very specific. It's specifying that what is going to be investigated is the Night of Long Knives, how it helped consolidate Hitler's power, and the year that's being focused on is 1934. So that's all that's needed there. Secondly, the next thing that we have to do is we have to briefly explain the nature of the 2 sources and explain why they are relevant to the investigation. So, i.e., you must state whether your source is a primary source or a secondary source, a speech, a journal, a history book, etc. So, for example, the first source is The Third Reich in Power by R.J. Evans. It is a history book and a secondary source published in 2005 and is relevant to the investigation as there is an entire chapter devoted to the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, so again, you can see I haven't written too much, but I've introduced the source. I've introduced the nature of the source. I've said it's a history book. I have said it's a secondary source. I've also included the date of publication. And I have explained briefly its relevance to the investigation. So finally, you only actually have one more thing to do now. And this is the hardest part. So this is the part where you're going to spend more time writing. You're going to use up more of your word count in this part. So finally, you must analyze the 2 sources in detail. You must reference their origin, purpose, and content while analyzing their values and limitations in relation to the investigation. Okay, so let's look at an example of how to do that. So R.J. Evans is one of the world's leading historians on modern Germany and held the title of Regius Professor of History, a senior post at Cambridge University. Thus, The Origin of the Source is of extreme value to an investigation into events in Germany in 1934. The purpose of the book is to give a comprehensive account of Hitler's time in power from 1933 to 1945. This is a slight limitation of the source for the investigation, as the book focuses on a 12-year period, while the investigation focuses solely on 1 year. Thus, a lot of the content will not be relevant to the investigation. However, some content from the source is extremely valuable, not only because there is a whole chapter focusing on the Night of the Long Knives, but also because it includes quotations from contemporary figures like Hitler himself and includes numerous key statistics, like the fact that 74 people were killed on the Night of the Long Knives. These quotations and statistics played an important role in informing the investigation. Okay, so you can see there that values and limitations have both been discussed of the source, and reference has been made to the origin of the source, to the purpose of the source, and the content of the source. So it is ticking all of the boxes. Again, you can see it's obviously more substantial than what was written for the first thing that you have to do and the second thing you have to do, because there's more to say. But you can see it's not overly lengthy, it's very concise. And actually, if you put all of these together, it comes to just under 250 words, which is exactly the amount that you're aiming at for section, well, obviously for discussing one of your sources for section 1. And then you have about 250 words left for your second source. So from here, basically, you go on and you do all of the above for your second source, and hey presto, you've completed section 1 of the IA. So hopefully that's cleared up some things for you, some questions you might have had about section 1 of the IA. Good luck with it. If you do have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you and goodbye.